So one of the things I enjoy doing is I enjoy actually going to the other side and basically saying like, so what do you say? Like, oh, okay, so you agree with this point. Oh, cool. And then I build off of that. So as far as I know, the guy who wrote this book, he is not a Christian. I don't know if he's let's see, he's a professor of religion at Ingeborg Rennert. Yeah, sure. He's an Ingeborg Rennert Professor of Jewish Studies at Barnard College. So this guy, this is, don't read this one, but it's weighty. But what this guy does in this book particular is, like I said, I don't think he's a Christian, but what he's doing is he's tracing the fact that as you go through the Old Testament, you run into this two powers in heaven idea. And so apparently, from what I've looked into, Jewish culture actually accepted the idea that there were two powers in the Godhead. And you'll see this play out when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah, because there's the idea in Sodom and Gomorrah of the Lord raining fire from the Lord, you know. So you've got someone on earth, you know, and he's talking, you know, he's the Lord, and he's raining fire from the Lord who's in heaven. And so you clearly have the Lord in two different locations at once. And you will see the name of God used almost as a person. A lot of other stuff. And so Jewish culture and the teachings actually accepted the idea of two powers in the Godhead all the way up until the Christian era. Once you hit the Christian era, they start distancing themselves from that because it sounds an awful lot like the Trinity. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing, but again, it's not a Christian source, and it's tracing kind of what the rabbis would teach about various topics. So again, having a book like that is intriguing. Books like this, so Henry Morris wrote this way back in the day, and this is a fascinating book. It's a weightier, like it's got a lot to it. But what I do sometimes when I'm researching, I will actually go to the footnotes, and I will double check some of what they say in the footnotes. I don't know if you guys have ever had this where you're reading something and you just kind of have that like gut instinct of like, that sounds too far-fetched. Like that sounds too good to be true. And so I've run into that a time or two where I've had to go then do some research. And the one book in particular that any of you who've been in one of my classes before, you know I've referenced this one before, but I do have to bring it up because it is the perfect illustration of terrible research. And so this book is New Age Bible Versions by Gail Riplinger, and it is just splendidly bad, okay? And I don't disagree with her premise. That's the fun thing. So you guys know, like I'm a King James guy. That's what I use. The only times I don't use a King James is when I'm preaching at a church that basically asks me to use a different version. Now, that gets me in trouble, but that's neither here nor there. This lady is trying to prove that all the other versions are satanic corruptions. Maybe they are, I don't know, but this book doesn't prove it, okay? So this is an illustration of, even if you agree with the premise of the book, make sure you double check the research, all right? My rule of thumb is if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so as you read this, like I remember thumbing through it one time and I was like, this sounds really good. Like, wow, if that is true, like that just puts a nail in the coffin of that, you know. It does not take you long to do the slightest bit of research to find out that this lady doesn't know how to do research. Like, it is abysmally bad. Those of you who've been in my class before, you know I've used these illustrations, but let me show you how this works for the sake of those who haven't been. There will be times if I said this, like, I'm Mike, and I love dogs and hate cats. Okay? So if that's the quote that I made, this is the level of scholarship that she practices in her book. I'm Mike, and I ... hate cats. Okay, I mean that's okay, but it still cuts out like an important part about like, well, this guy's just a hateful dude. I mean, he always talks about how much he hates things. He never talks about what he loves. What about this right here? Like, I could really, like, I told you I love dogs and I hate cats. Well, all you talk about is hate. Or, to get even worse, there are times where it really seems like, you know, I'm Mike and I ... hate ... dogs. And you're like, wait, hold on, that's not, no. And so there's like rearranged quotes, there's ellipses that like cut out important chunks, and then entire conclusions are made based on things that are cut out. That's not good scholarship. So as you're reading through a quote, if you come upon a quote and you're like, what is this ... here? Okay, if there's a ... you might want to find out what the ... is being removed, all right? And so just, again, there's a lot of charts in here. She really, really likes her charts. But again, it's just not the best research. So that's why I would avoid the book. I keep it on my shelf because it's a good object lesson. And I have sat in people's offices who are not King James onlyists, and they've had this book sitting on their shelf, and I can only imagine, I'm like, please don't judge King James people with this book. It's like you've had some guys who've come out in defense of the King James who attack her for her scholarship. So even King James people come after her because she's pretty bad. So anyway, the level of research, though, the reason I bring this up is because if her stuff was true, it would be so clinching. Like, the debate would be over. And that's where, if the debate's still going on, it means probably no one has come up with the clincher. Like, so just keep that in mind. The other thing that I try to keep in mind as I'm doing research is when it comes to scientific stuff, I try to keep as current as possible. So you'll notice some of the books that I have in my collection. These ones, so Darwin Devolves, Darwin's Doubt, these books, they've come out in the last like 2 years. So they're very, very current. So they're like the latest science that you can get your hands on. They are covering some really important developments that there's been in science since like the last time I taught this class. And so you can't just rest on your laurels, so to speak, and go, well, I mean, this was true 7 years ago, so it must be true. Like, no, science progresses, and so you kind of need to keep up with what science is saying. That's why I like that zombie science book by Jonathan Wells, because what he's doing is he's saying, I wrote this book in 2000. This is what I said in 2000. I was debunking what they said for all that time. They didn't listen, and now look what they're publishing in 2009, and 2015, and 2013. And what he's doing is he's bringing up stuff in the last decade and saying, they're still keeping at it, even though they know, and even though their own people are telling them it's wrong. So I summarize all that to say this: make sure you stay up with current stuff, especially when you're talking science. Make sure you have that. Every now and then, from a philosophical standpoint, you can use some of the older stuff. So one of the books I have here, David Berlinski wrote the book, The Deniable Darwin. I have a lot of books with Darwin in the title in my library. But these are just like a series of essays. But again, a lot of them are from the 90s. It's not saying that they're outdated. It's just there are going to be some things in here that you're like, okay, the science may have progressed beyond this point, but as far as like history of science, it might still be good as far as a resource. He's going to be providing you with logic. He's going to be providing you with some understanding that isn't going to change. But as far as like the scientific facts, just make sure that the scientific facts are up to date with some of these things. All right. This one I found was interesting. Back in, probably 2012 or something. I'm not sure exactly. 2014. Bill Nye and Ken Ham did a debate at the Creation Museum. And it was a really good debate. I enjoyed it. I thought Ken Ham did a really, really good job. Bill Nye, not so much. In fact, Bill Nye used some... Yeah.
He was like bringing up the point, and he's like, I literally just did not say that.
Yeah. So I don't automatically take the side of creationists all the time, because again, there are times where creationists use excuses that you're like, it's just terrible. Don't use that. But I think Ken Ham did a really good job. And so this book is especially if you've seen the debate, is a really good follow-up, because this thing brings up things. So one of the ones that I enjoy, and I bring it up typically when I talk about the flood, which we're getting into today. But when I talk about the flood, Bill Nye brings up this illustration of a ship that was made by New England shipbuilders. Figure that one out. And he talks about like how great the New England shipbuilders were. Okay, yeah, I mean they were, I'm pretty sure if anyone's building a ship, they're probably fairly good at it, but whatever. And he's like, and this ship went out into the ocean and it got caught in the waves and cracked and it sank. All right, so a boat sank. What he doesn't tell you is it was like 13 years of use, and then it got caught and it sank. What does that prove? The ark was not being used for 14 years, okay? It was used for about a year, you know, and like, so you think about some of the stuff that he says, and when you start looking at some of this other evidence, you kind of go, that excuse doesn't hold water at all. So that's another book there that would be useful. The reason I recommend this other book here, so I'll bring out a few more books here. So again, Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. Again, brand new book, came out last year or the year before. This is going to be a really, really good, from a philosophical standpoint, from a theological standpoint, even from just the standpoint of like, this is a way to help people who are stuck in these sins. It's going to be a really good examination of basically the postmodern worldview. So that there's a worldview that basically, as you guys remember from my discussion a few months ago, hopefully, there's a worldview that basically says your mind and your body are separate. That's kind of our current trend in our culture. And so what you think has more impact than what you are. So if you are a female, but you think that you're a male, well, then you're a female-bodied person. You're not a female. You're just a female-bodied person. You're actually a male inside your head. And so her whole point is you need to love your body, as in God made your body the way He wants it, and you need to live in light of that. And I think this is just an excellent source because it does double duty. Not only is it going to explain the problem, it's going to give you help on how to solve the problem. And so, again, we'll touch on homosexuality a little bit in this class, but as you study out the homosexual issues, it really is this, God made you a certain way. You don't really have the option to say, God, you didn't know what you were doing. I want you to change me back or change me into something else. Like, He designed you on purpose. And there's a lot of excuses people use where they're like, well, what about these people with both? You know, they're both male and female. Okay, that is such a rarity that it hardly merits bringing into the discussion most of the time. Because the vast majority of people who claim to be transgender actually aren't intersex, which would be the term for I'm both. They're basically fully male, they just think they're a woman. Okay, well that's a mental health issue, or a sin issue, or both. Like, so we need to deal with it as such. And so she goes into a lot of that stuff. So again, highly recommend the book. It takes about 11 hours to listen to if you're listening to it on Audible, or you can listen to it at 1.5 speed and get it done in like 8. So there's that. The other book that I recommend, I realize I'm going through a lot here, but Lee Strobel's The Case for the Creator. He's going to come from more of an intelligent design perspective, and he's going to lay it out. He was a skeptic, and he was actually brought to Christ by investigating the earlier book, The Case for Christ, where he was investigating, you know, basically the legitimate nature of Christ existing. And as he did the research, he came around and got saved. But then he started doing research on this whole idea of, well, does evolution actually fit the facts that we see? And so what this does is this investigates all sorts of different areas. And one of the ones that's really fascinating that we sometimes use in our science camp is the fact that our location in the universe is actually perfectly located to actually investigate the universe. So we're right on the outside edge of a solar system and galaxy, so that the light from the stars aren't blinding us, but they're also, we're close enough to be protected, but not so close to be blinded. And we're right in that location where we can see most of the rest of the universe. And so it allows us to make measurements, it allows us to do a lot of stuff. Our position is just perfect because the proportions of the moon to the sun, distance-wise, the moon and the sun are the exact same size, so that we can have eclipses. Perspective-wise, it's obviously not, you know, really happening. But there's just a lot of stuff that's really, really cool. And he brings up a lot of that stuff in his book because he's talking to scientists. So again, just some of these books I highly recommend for part of that reading project. I think would be really helpful. And then one of the fun ones that is more down to earth, and it's got big print. So But this one is the politically incorrect guide to the Bible. And obviously not all of this would apply to this class, but it does get into just some of the reasons why we would trust the Bible. And this does not necessarily agree with me with everything. So this is going to take the local flood theory, and they're actually going to run with that. So they don't believe in a worldwide flood, they believe more in a local flood. But the reason a source like this is valuable is because you know the source is at least trusting what the Bible says, and they're at least taking it seriously enough, and they just disagree with some of our position. So again, my goal is not to get you to doubt everything, but my goal is to get you to say, I'm at least going to give the other side the benefit of the doubt to hear what they have to say, and if what I believe is true, then I should have sufficient evidence to back up what I say. Ultimately, it's going to come down to faith, but I think you're going to have some fun stuff in interacting with that. Last book here, because I've already introduced most of the other books over here. This is more of, obviously more of an Exodus book, hence the name, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. But this is an interesting follow-up to this class if it's of interest to you. This guy did a lot of research, and what he did is he realized that the chronologies of Egypt, which is where we get a lot of our that goes back 7,000-8,000 years. And he actually tried to narrow down exactly when the Exodus would have happened. And instead of trying to figure it out by a date, what he did is he tried to look and say, okay, you've got a prosperous time, you've got a collapse, you've got an exile of a lot of, a migration of a lot of people. When in Egyptian history did we see that happen? And he was able to kind of trace it and put all those pieces together and try to figure out when in Egyptian chronology the Exodus would have happened. And so that's kind of a neat one. It has a documentary that goes along with it, which we may or may not watch depending on what we have time for in this class. I'm having to move a little quicker through some of this material than I would like to, but we're making good time, just not as fast as I would hope. So anyway, that's another book that I would recommend to your reading after this class. And the documentary is in my office, I think, so if you want to watch that, it's a pretty good one. I enjoyed it, but I enjoy most things. So, all right, so there's just some books, and there you go. This book right here is one that I'm going to be referencing periodically, but it is like a general commentary on Genesis. So if you're looking for stuff that is not exclusively creation, evolution, and stuff, then I'd recommend thumbing through that one. But again, it does have some stuff. So it has like a model of the ark in here and some perspectives that you can. John Davis. So Paradise to Prison. So those are just some Genesis sources as you guys are researching.